From the 22 News Plus studio, this is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of InFocus. I am your host, Patrick Berry, and we've got a very fascinating conversation coming out of the 22 News Plus studios today. I'm joined here by folks from the New England Innocence Project. First off, it is Radha Natarajan, if I've got that correctly. She is the executive director of the New England Innocence Project, and Stephanie Hartung, who is, her title is senior staff attorney for the New England Innocence Project. Thank you both so very much for joining me today. I want to start with you, Radha. Did you begin the New England Innocence Project, or is this a role you got into later in your career?
So first, thank you, Patrick, so much for having us. I certainly did not found the New England Innocence Project. It was founded in 2000 and became a nonprofit in 2004. And actually, last year we celebrated our 20th anniversary. I was a public defender in Massachusetts and Roxbury at the Roxbury Defenders. And so I was doing criminal law. And I made the switch to come to the New England Innocence Project in 2015. So 10 years ago now, yes. I came over as a staff attorney. And after a few years, I became the executive director, and I've been there ever since.
So through your time in your practicing world, you must have come across people who were wrongly convicted. And is that your passion?
So even before I became a lawyer, I learned about wrongful convictions, and that's actually what compelled me to become a public defender. So I had worked with a federal judge in New York when I was in law school. And in that context, I was reviewing letters from people who were writing to him as a federal judge saying, I was wrongfully convicted, I'm innocent. And I would look into those cases. And one of the things that shocked me is that even though he, as a judge, had the power, and a federal judge, he had the power to look at convictions and overturn them. But under our laws, there's so many obstacles to overturning or even a wrongful conviction, and innocence is not enough to overturn a conviction.
Wow.
Which is something that, as a law student, it actually surprised me.
I think as a general public, that's surprising.
Exactly. And so I thought about, where could I place my legal education? Where would I be in most need? And I thought becoming a public defender, I would be able to maybe prevent some of these wrongful convictions.
Okay.
And so
sense.
I decided to do that. In that role, it was incredible representing individuals. I loved being a public defender. And I felt that there was an opportunity at the New England Innocence Project, not only to represent people, individuals, but also to create systemic change. And so that's really why I made the switch.
Wow. All right, Stephanie, let's hear your story. So tell me a little bit about your background and how you ended up at NEIP.
Sure. So I'm a senior staff attorney at NEIP, and I have had this role for 3 years now. But I've been doing post-conviction innocence work for a good part of my career. I was a law professor in Boston for almost 20 years at Suffolk and Northeastern law schools, and served on NEIP's board before joining the staff full-time 3 years ago. So in my former role as a professor, I was involved more in supervising students who would review cases for NEIP, and also doing research and writing scholarship about the causes of wrongful conviction and some of the things that make overturning wrongful convictions so difficult. So I've been thrilled to have made the transition to get to do this work full time.
You are a unique story because most people get into those teaching jobs and never want to leave. But again, like Radha's, your passion was making sure justice is served.
Yes, I made a crazy decision to leave the cushy world of academia. Not always cushy, but it's a wonderful job in many ways. And I did love being a teacher, but I wanted to be able to focus all my time on doing this work. And I'm glad that I made that switch.
And I'm sure there are many of your clients who are glad you guys both made those decisions. So probably the biggest question I have for both of you, I'll throw it out there. Either of you can tackle it. I, as an outsider looking in, I have to imagine your phones ring off the hook all day long from those incarcerated or their family members pleading with you that my loved one or I am in here improperly. Is that the case? Do you guys really have a lot of incoming calls? You're shaking your heads.
Absolutely. Patrick, I think one of the most difficult things is actually not being able to help all of the people who contact us. So we have people who contact us by phone. We have a lot of people who write letters to us who are incarcerated throughout the 6 New England states. As you know, or as you may know, that, our work is on people who've been wrongfully convicted, but we actually start getting calls from people who are in the pretrial stage. They
Wow.
haven't been convicted yet, but they're seeing how things are going. They're seeing the unfairness of the criminal legal system, and they're reaching out to us saying, I'm afraid that I'm going to get wrongfully convicted. Can you help me? And so it starts even earlier, even though we can't intervene at that stage, and we don't. But one of the things is that, we get letters every week. We have way more people who reach out to us than we could possibly help. We have limited resources. We have a small staff,
Right.
and we have to investigate every single application that comes in. And so each letter is read, each letter is responded to, each application is screened. We spend years doing investigation, years,
Wow.
in order to know whether we can bring that case to court, because it is so hard to overturn a conviction that in order to do that, we have to do scientific testing if the evidence is available. We have to locate witnesses. We have to speak to experts who can tell us whether the evidence originally was unreliable. And all of these things, go into every case. And some of these cases that people reach out to us, they're very old. And unfortunately, in some of those cases, critical witnesses have passed away. Evidence has been lost. There are things that have happened that make it nearly impossible, if not impossible, for someone to prove their innocence. And so, unfortunately, even when people are innocent, we may not be able to assist with their cases because of the restrictions in court to being able to get back into court and just the availability of evidence.
You bring up a very good point, because some of these requests are could be decades old. So I guess, I mean, we could probably talk for an hour about how you determine from all of those incoming calls and letters, how do you determine what's a valid case? From I'm in the pretrial to I've been in jail for 40 years. How do you determine what cases you take?
So there are many, there's a lot of research that's been done on wrongful convictions over the last several decades. And from that, we've learned some of the red flags of wrongful convictions. So some of those might be eyewitness misidentification, false confessions, incentivized witnesses, flawed forensics, official misconduct, right? These are sort of some categories of things. Racial bias is a really significant one. So there's a number of categories that cases fall under through the research, through the data about exonerations. And so that's one lens in which we look at the cases. Another thing we look at is what has happened before, because under our court system, you have to have new evidence in order to come forward. It can't just be saying
Rehashing the old stuff that's already
right,
been through court multiple times.
right. And so one of the most difficult things is that, sometimes someone actually had DNA evidence that demonstrated innocence, and they were still denied, relief. And so we have to look at, is there something new that is here? Is there something we can do? And so that's one of the things that we look at. And I think Stephanie can talk to, in our client, in the most recent exoneration for Edward Wright, sort of some of the difficulties we had in that case.
Yeah, so as Radha said, and as I think you're aware, so Edward Wright is the most recent exoneration here in Massachusetts. He was exonerated just this summer.
Mhm.
He, after spending 41 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit, a Springfield murder, he was finally released and exonerated. And there, he's an extraordinary person, and his case is extraordinary. But sadly, it's also part of a larger pattern that Radha is alluding to here, especially here in the Commonwealth. We see a pattern of racial bias, police and prosecutorial misconduct, followed up with a failure of accountability. And all those things were present in Mr. Wright. We call him Eddie, actually, but in Eddie's case. And he was only 22 years old when he was arrested for the murder of Penny Anderson, his friend. And he never had a motive to kill her. No motive was ever presented, but he had been the last person seen with her, something he never denied or hid in any way. And because of that, he became the sole focus of the police investigation. And he went through a jury trial. He was a young man with no experience, very little experience at all with the criminal system. And like many people, assumed that the truth would come out in the system. And he went to trial. He had every black male juror was stricken from the pool. He was forced to be seated away from his attorney. And then he got convicted of a murder he didn't commit, and he was sentenced to die in prison.
So, so that case was 40. Well, he was in jail for 41 years. So the case is longer than that. How long did NEIP work on this? Like the last 2 years or so?
10 years.
Okay.
10 years. These cases take an incredibly long time to get back into the courts. And Mr. Wright's case, again, it was unique in certain ways. After he was convicted, years before we ever met him or knew about his case, he began fighting to overturn his conviction. He tried, before we were involved, 5 separate times to get his conviction overturned in the courts. And each time the courts turned him away. He presented all kinds of new evidence of innocence, including that another man had confessed to the crime, had broken into the crime scene after it occurred, had lied about his alibi, had threatened the victim. All these things were presented to the courts, but they continued to turn him away. And so when his case first came to us in 2015, we started to reinvestigate it. And it was a case that was compelling to us because all of this evidence of innocence, but also so challenging because he had been through the court so many times. We knew that we would have an even more difficult time than usual getting a new court to pay attention to our claims. But, so our investigation involved all the things that Rod has been talking about. We did DNA testing. He was excluded from all the key pieces of evidence connected to the murder. Eddie's DNA wasn't there, but another man's DNA was. We had experts who looked at the forensic evidence and determined that some of the things that were used to convict Eddie at trial that were passed as science were not reliable and wouldn't be acceptable in the courts today.
Okay, we are up on our first commercial break. We are here with Radha and Stephanie from the New England Innocence Project. We'll be right back after this.
This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry. This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.
Welcome back to today's edition of In Focus. We're here in the 22 News Plus studio. I am so happy today to be joined by Stephanie and Radha from the New England Innocence Project. Radha is the executive director, and Stephanie is a senior staff attorney. Thank you both for joining me. They drove out from Boston to have this conversation, so I really do appreciate your time today, folks. Stephanie, when we were talking a few minutes ago, you had mentioned that the Edward Wright case was 10 years in the making. Is that typical, number one? And number two, kind of following up on that is, why did it take 10 years? Why not 9 years ago? You're like, oh, hey, success, move on to the next one. What's the typical process for working with an incarcerated person?
Sadly, 10 years is not unusual. It can take that long for a wrongful conviction to get overturned. What we know and what we see time after time is that a jury hears a certain narrative or story that gets presented at trial, and once a conviction happens, there is a strong tendency to cling to that narrative, and there's a resistance. It can be a fierce resistance that we see to looking at any evidence that contradicts that narrative.
Who's that resistance? Is that our local prosecutorial staff? Is that where the resistance comes from? Is it the judicial people that don't want to revisit this case that they've already seen multiple times? Where's that come from?
It's a great question, and it comes from all sides.
Okay.
It comes from the prosecutors. It comes from the courts. As an example, in Eddie's case, as I mentioned, he had tried 5 times
Right.
and failed to bring his case to the courts.
When he was doing that, was he defending himself? Was he trying to present this, or did he have an attorney previously that was just trying and unsuccessful?
He had, at times he was representing himself, but for the most part, he had other attorneys
Okay.
not connected to the New England Innocence Project. And each time he was bringing new evidence to the courts, but each time the court determined that it was not enough. And this time, when we moved forward with Mr. Wright's 6th motion for new trial, which we filed in 2023, it was after we had not only developed new DNA results that excluded Mr. Wright, new forensic analysis that showed that the evidence was unreliable, but we also learned that the police and prosecutors had been hiding evidence for decades, evidence that could have supported Mr. Wright's innocence.
So do you find that in other cases as well? Sort of similar patterns that, and again, maybe it's modern technology, modern society that we kind of look back on those cases, people of color just wrongfully convicted, people of certain living environments wrongfully convicted. But do you think in today's age, we're a more aware society that we want more justice? I don't even know if I'm phrasing that right.
I mean, I think we always want more justice, but whether or not there's been real changes in the criminal legal system, even since 1984 when Eddie was prosecuted, wrongfully prosecuted, I think there has been some changes, but not so many. So as just one example, in Eddie's case, evidence was withheld from him that had been in his police file. And there was a rule then, and there is a rule now, that the prosecution has to turn over evidence that's helpful to someone who's being accused of a crime. But just a few years ago, the Department of Justice did an investigation of the Springfield Police Department's narcotics unit. And then there had to be a lawsuit to get the Hampden County District Attorney's Office to investigate and turn over evidence of misconduct. And so this is not a 1984 problem. This is a ongoing problem.
Right. So, but again, are those systemic issues throughout your client base? Maybe not unique to Hampden County, but could be Middlesex County, could be Suffolk. Pick a county or a state. I mean, is it systemic across the board?
Absolutely. One of the things that we're able to do, because data is collected about all the exonerations of wrongly convicted people in the country. And when I use the word exonerations, what we're talking about is people who are wrongly convicted based on factual innocence, had their convictions overturned and their charges dismissed. There have been over 3,700 people wrongly convicted in the United States since cases have been started to be collected. In Massachusetts, there's been 95. And those numbers are staggering, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. For every person who's been exonerated, there are so many more still in custody fighting to overturn their conviction. And to answer your question about whether things like police and prosecutorial misconduct, withholding evidence, is that systemic? What we know in Massachusetts, 80% of men who've been wrongly convicted of murder, 80% of Black men wrongly convicted of murder have had police and prosecutorial misconduct involved in their case. That's 4 out of 5 Black men.
Right.
For the general public, the figure is more like 60 or 65%. So we do see an increase and a racial disparity there. We also know that Hampden County, where we are here in Chicopee and Springfield, has the second highest number of wrongful convictions in the Commonwealth, second only to Suffolk County, where, of course, Boston is.
Right. We are up on our second commercial break. We will be right back after this.
This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry. This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.
Welcome back, everyone. In today's edition of In Focus, we're talking about wrongly convicted individuals, not only here in the Bay State, but across New England. The New England Innocence Project, I'm joined by Aradha and Stephanie. New England Innocence Project helps those wrongly convicted find freedom outside of bars. And I greatly appreciate your time. You drove out from Boston, so thank you so very much. Radha, let me ask you, you and your staff, as we mentioned earlier, get inundated with requests. How big is your staff? How many people? I mean, do you have dozens of people across the 6 New England states that are working with you to review these cases and determine what has teeth and which ones your group works with?
I wish we had dozens of people across the 6 New England states. So we have 16 people on staff who work on various parts of our mission, and we have 6 attorneys, including me, who.
So you're an active attorney in the process. You're not just the administrator.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yes, I can't give up my litigation. I love representing people, and so yes, I'm on the legal team as well. And one thing that we realized is that just our staff alone is not enough to overturn these convictions. And so for each of our legal cases, what we do is that we have 1 to 2 attorneys from the New England Innocence Project. So we have expertise in overturning wrongful convictions. We know what it takes to do that. We have that experience. We're well versed in some of the scientific areas or other areas that are relevant. And then we build a team for every single case in which we're going to investigate. And so we're very fortunate to have partnerships with pro bono law firms or retired lawyers, other volunteers who actually say, yes, we want to be a part of this. And so, we were talking earlier about Eddie Wright's case. He had a number of pro bono partners from the law firms of Skadden and also Quinn Emanuel. And so we really built out a team. And honestly, that's what it takes, Patrick.
So I want to use the phrase a small army, but it certainly
is.
sounds like. How many people were on Eddie's case?
Oh, wow.
Hard to
my
count.
gosh. I didn't count. I mean, there was at least a dozen attorneys and paralegals. Then there were multiple forensic experts. There were 2 DNA laboratories alone. There was multiple investigators, factual investigators. So just really, it is a small army.
So my follow-up would be, that's not free. So what funds you? How do you, these laboratories, which DNA testing takes time, it's expensive. How do you fund all this?
Well, so fascinating.
Probably a lot longer answer than I thought.
It is, but it's also fascinating because when we talk about Mr. Wright's case, Eddie's case. So in 2017, when we had decided to move forward with Eddie's case, the New England Innocence Project had run out of funding and actually was going to close its doors.
Oh wow!
But but we had Eddie's case. We had gotten an agreement to do DNA testing in his case, and the quote for that testing was $22,000.
Wow!
And we did not have the funding for that. Mr. Wright, he had been incarcerated for decades at this point, and he had suffered abuses in prison and had actually by himself sued the Department of Correction and won a civil judgment against them for abuses he had suffered. And he had received a monetary judgment about that, and he decided that he would pay for his DNA testing. That is how significant. I mean, he knew that was essential to prove his innocence. It was important to him, and it's the first time and only time that the New England Innocence Project has had to rely on a client to do their own testing. Right. Fortunately,
it sounds like you lucked out that he had won that judgment to sort of help fund his own defense moving forward. Your other clients don't have that ability.
That's true. And so we were very fortunate. We have a number of community support. We have foundations and we have corporate entities, and we have support from the general public. Most of our funding, comes from the public. And so we are a nonprofit. And so we rely actually on public support in order to keep us going, so that nobody else has ever, since Mr. Wright, either before or after, has ever had to rely on that. We've been able to fund the testing. We've been able to fund the investigation. We've been able to fund forensic experts, right? All of those things have happened because of public support. And so we do absolutely rely on that. We do not get government funding for those things. And so it's really significant.
So Stephanie, the pro bono side of it, so you recruit, or not recruit, do you have these firms that you partner with? Are they sort of like on a list? I mean, hey, these guys specialize in X, Y, or Z. We can call them. They have a group of attorneys that will help us out in this project.
Yeah, well, mostly so with the law firms or folks who have expressed an interest in partnering with us, and they don't need to have any special kind of expertise. They tend to be, excellent and hardworking lawyers who we team up with, and we strategize and we divide up tasks. And as Radha said, we're partnering with them with our experience and expertise in the field. And aside from law firms, we also sometimes will have individual attorneys who are retired and want to work with us and have some expertise to share. We sometimes partner with law school clinics.
I was going to ask you
Yeah.
if that, because of how you
Yes.
describe you getting into it. So do you recruit some of the Boston area law school
Absolutely.
students to help do research and things like that?
Absolutely. And law students play a critical role. They sometimes will help in the initial screening process with cases. That's something I did with my own students. In fact, when I was a professor at Suffolk Law School, my students and I reviewed Eddie's case and helped to do the initial screening of Eddie's case for the New England Innocence Project back in 2015. So, students play a really critical role. And as Radha said, it's just not the kind of work you can do by yourself.
Right.
It very much takes a team.
So when you finally settle on these are the ones that we are going to work with. So you guys are no longer involved in the Eddie case. So are you now on a new case? Are you now on a new case? So is that
a new case?
Yeah. Well, that brings up another good question. So are you constantly working like 4, 5, 6, 7, 20 cases at a time, you and the other attorneys within NEIP? Is that like a standard day? You're working multiple cases at a time?
We have about 100 active investigations right now.
100?
Yes, we have 300, almost 400 now open applications. And so those are ones that we have to screen or at various stages of the process.
Okay.
But I call them open investigations because before we decide whether we can actually bring those cases to court, we have to do years of investigation, right? In Eddie's case, we had decided to take his case in 2015, but we did not get the full police file in his case. He had never seen the full police file in his case until 2021. Okay, that is 36 years after he was prosecuted for this.
So isn't that the original attorney's job to get that information?
It's actually the prosecutor's job to turn over information. It has
Okay.
been a constitutional right of someone who is accused of a crime and presumed innocent under the law that they should get access to all of the information that may be favorable to their defense. That is a fundamental part of our criminal legal system. And so, yes, in Eddie's case, that did not happen. And one thing, Patrick, you may not know is, so you're entitled to that when you are pretrial, so before you've been convicted. But once you're convicted, you don't have an entitlement to get full access to your file anymore because now you're convicted. You don't have the presumption of innocence. So one of the big changes that the New England Innocence Project would like to see is that people who are fighting, after they've been convicted, to demonstrate that they've been wrongfully convicted, that they should get access to the evidence in their case. They should get access to the files, and that's something that has proven to be significant, not just in Eddie's case, but so many others.
We are up on our next commercial break. We'll be right back after this.
This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry. This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.
Welcome back, everyone, to this edition of In Focus. I am your host, Patrick Berry. We're here in the 22 News Plus studios with Radha Natarajan. I know I always have a hard time with your last name, and I apologize for that. And Stephanie Hartung there from the New England Innocence Project. And we're talking about how they do what they do. They cover all 6 New England states. And during the break, we were just kind of bantering back and forth about the uniqueness of each state. Granted, there are some base levels of justice across all states, but each one probably has its own nuances. So how do you balance that? Maine is going to be different than Connecticut, which is different from Rhode Island and from Massachusetts and New Hampshire. How do you balance the different justice systems, I guess, for lack of a better description?
I mean, the criminal legal system is so local that honestly, so in Massachusetts, every county itself is different in terms of, so it's not different in terms of like what are the rules we would use to bring a case forward, but it might be different in terms of whether they would voluntarily turn something over or, just how they look at wrongful convictions. And so that's even more amplified across New England. So as an example of this, in New Hampshire, you only have 3 years to be able to present new evidence um, in your case in order to overturn a wrongful conviction. 3 years.
Really?
And so if you end up being able to, prove your innocence, but it's past those 3 years, you don't have you are shut down in the courts. And so this is an obstacle that we don't face here, but that we face in our New Hampshire cases.
How's that possible? I wouldn't think there'd be like a statute of limitations, if that's the right phrase. I would think that, if you find if there's proof out there or information that someone has been wrongfully convicted, that's a lifetime. You can find that out in 40, 50 years. It doesn't matter.
Should be enough. It's not enough, and it's for a number of reasons. I mean, I think one is that, because they make it so difficult to prove a wrongful conviction, they begin to believe that there are no wrongful convictions there,
Okay.
right? And so then they have this notion that we don't need any changes in what is happening because no one's bringing them forward, right? So if you shut them down, then you don't see them, right? So I think that's a part of it. There's also just an extreme, belief that, that they have enough procedural sort of rights in place in the front end that mistakes are not going to be made. And we know that that's not true.
I mean, I think everybody knows our legal system is overwhelmed right now. So in those cases, do those, like, take New Hampshire, for example, because you brought it up, do the people who make those decisions in New Hampshire say, if we make this change, then our system is going to be even that much more overwhelmed? But conversely, we've got people sitting in jails who shouldn't be in jail. It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
I think it's part of this and parcel of the same problem that makes it so difficult to overturn a wrongful conviction. There's been a trial, a jury's heard the evidence. We're finished with this case. We're moving
Right.
on to the next ones. And so, Eddie's case is such a good example that even after he demonstrated actually to a federal court, it was a Massachusetts case, but he went up to a federal court through what's called a habeas corpus petition. And he presented evidence that the victim's ex-boyfriend had motive and opportunity and confessed twice to committing the murder. A federal judge said, this is credible evidence, and found that Eddie met what's called an actual innocence threshold. And still, he remained in prison for 15 more years.
Wow.
So that's what we are up against. And that's part of why it takes so long for each wrongful conviction to get overturned, even when there is this new evidence that comes forward. And it's even harder in states like New Hampshire that haven't had as many convictions overturned, and there's not as much of a realization as to what's going on.
So a question I sort of glossed over earlier was, okay, the Eddie Wright thing, that was this year. So how many people have you exonerated or freed this year in 2025?
So Eddie Wright is the only exoneration that has happened this year for the New England Innocence Project. And, we don't have exonerations every year. Sometimes we have multiple exonerations in a year because it's not something that you can time.
Okay.
It is something that happens, so Eddie's case took 10 years. There might be a case that takes 2 or 3 years. There might be a case that takes even longer, right? Sometimes, so there's various reasons that things happen. And, our attorneys, have been on staff for many years, and now we have a number of cases that are ready for litigation. And so those are going to be going to court next year. And so will they resolve next year? I don't know. Eddie's case, we filed it on wrongful conviction day, actually, in 2023. And so this is our 2-year anniversary of that, of filing that. And so even just in litigation in court, it took 1.5 years, for the actual exoneration. And so, things in the court system take an incredibly long time.
Did COVID slow it down?
I don't think it slowed it down in this particular case. We had done the DNA testing prior to COVID, and we were investigating the case throughout, during the lockdown and all of those. There were, you know, it was terrible, during the initial lockdown. So many of our incarcerated clients were really in jeopardy in prison. Many people passed away in prison during COVID, during the initial, lockdown and pandemic. And so, but no, I don't think that it slowed it down in Eddie's case. But keep in mind, we didn't receive the evidence of that had been hidden from him until 2021. And
Okay.
so it was
COVID really wasn't a factor at that point. And
It
we're
really
on the tail
wasn't.
end of it, but it didn't slow it down. So for some of your other cases that you're working on, what have been some of the slowdowns? What are some of the obstacles that you guys have come up against?
One of the biggest ones is just getting access to the full case file.
Is that consistent throughout all your cases, is not
Yes.
having access to information?
Yes, we are constantly filing records requests. We're making requests of the prosecutors, but some will readily agree and some will not. Their policies vary really county by county and state by state. And so we spend a lot of our time just trying to track down the documents. And when we are able to get the complete record, like we finally did in Eddie's case in 2021, it's unfortunately not uncommon to find that there was information that should have been turned over. That's how an innocent person gets convicted, because not all the evidence is presented, so the truth can't come out. And that's what happened here.
So maybe because I'm looking at the world in through rose-colored glasses, but I always think it's both sides, the defense side and the prosecutorial side, are always trying to find correct and proper justice. But it seems like through our conversation that is the case to some extent, but it seems as if they just want to pin this on somebody and move on. Now, do you guys find that through your work, through all the cases that you're on, that people are just, okay, let's pin this on this person, let's move on? That just seems 1950s.
So first, I think you've hit on something, which is that there is significant pressure when harm has befallen somebody in our community, right? There is so much pressure to, quote, solve or close that case,
absolutely.
right? And so there is pressure to have an answer to the question of who committed this harm, right? And I think that the tools that we have to get those answers is actually, they're not very good. They're not very precise, right? And so you can rely on things like eyewitness misidentification. You can think, well, somebody has said that they saw someone. But for example, exoneree Dennis Mayer, that's a Massachusetts exoneree, 5 different eyewitnesses misidentified him, right? And so the prosecution relied on that evidence, but it was not accurate, right? And then DNA evidence proved that actually he wasn't the one who committed the crimes. We have evidence of incentivized witnesses, which leads to wrongful convictions. And so that's people who are, charges against them are dropped, or they're paid to again, provide answers to close a case, right? Prosecutors rely on this evidence, but we know, including in a case in Massachusetts where someone was sentenced to death, when we had the death penalty, Lawrence Adams, people whose, charges were dropped in order to testify against him, that turned out to be false. And so there's all these tools that are used in the criminal legal system to get to an answer. And it is an answer, but it's not
Not always the right answer. Right. We are up on our next commercial break. We'll be right back after this.
This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry. This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.
Welcome back, everyone, to the 22 News Plus studios. I am Patrick Berry, your host for InFocus, right here on 22 News. Joining me in the studio today are 2 women from the New England Innocence Project. I am so grateful that you drove out here from Boston to have this conversation, because I had no idea there was a New England Innocence Project until the news over the summer about Eddie Wright here in Springfield. We've talked about that. But this Thursday, October 2nd, it's National Wrongful Conviction Day, right?
Yes.
What is so important about that?
And actually International Wrongful
Okay.
Conviction Day. And
Probably
this,
not celebrated so much in some countries in the world
true,
as
but
much as it is here.
more countries than you'd think do
Right.
have innocence organizations working on wrongful convictions. And this year will be the 12th annual International Wrongful Conviction Day. And it's a day that we wish we didn't have to have, but
Right.
unfortunately we do. And the purpose is to bring awareness to the causes of wrongful convictions, the things that lead innocent people to get sent to prison for crimes they didn't commit, and also for the profound impacts that wrongful convictions have, not just on the individuals who themselves are wrongly incarcerated and lose
The families, the loved ones.
exactly, families, entire communities. There really are, we see it, the reverberating impacts of the harms of a wrongful conviction and incarceration. And so on Wrongful Conviction Day each year, we do a march, usually somewhere in Boston. And we really, it's two things. We're both celebrating the freedom of folks who have been wrongly convicted and now exonerated and who are able to be there with us. But at the same time, we're lifting up the voices and faces of people who are still incarcerated and still fighting and still in the fight, and we're standing with them. And we do that literally by holding up signs with their photos and names, and we march through Boston so people know this is what's happening.
Right.
And people are getting wrongly convicted. There's lots more who have not yet been able to secure their freedom.
Have you recruited any of your law school students to join?
Absolutely.
Have any of your students joined NEIP?
Well, we've had interns.
Okay.
A couple former students who've become interns. We have former students who've gone on to work in law firms who are now part of our team partnerships in
Okay.
various law firms.
Good.
So it's a wonderful team effort.
So I have to ask you this question. Okay, so we've talked for nearly an hour about getting those wrongfully convicted people out of jail and your passion for it, which truly comes through. Why aren't you prosecutors? Why aren't you on the other side really digging in? Because you seem to have that passion for innocence. So, and kind of what I've gathered from you both is that there's sort of a lack of that on the prosecutorial side. So why don't you switch sides and go really dig in and help people and really convict the right people, I guess is my question. You're on.
Oh, how much time do you have, Patrick? No, I mean, first of all, I want to stand with people who are fighting for the freedom. That's just fundamental to me. And also, I don't see the criminal legal system as providing safety for our communities. I mean, all of these folks who have been incarcerated in Massachusetts for things they did not commit, and yet our communities were told, you're safer now because they're in prison. The most dangerous people we've put them in prison. And so we've seen sort of not only that, people are getting wrongfully convicted, but that prison is not making us safer. And I think that it's for me personally, it is, I having seen what prison does to people, to families, it is intergenerational trauma. The idea of me putting someone in a cage is not possible.
Right. All right, Stephanie, I have to ask you the same question.
Yeah.
You were in academia for a long time talking about this with your students. Now you're at NEIP. Why not go the prosecutorial side and help really create good justice?
I think, our system that is set up now is fundamentally adversarial. And, we see it on TV. It's the stuff of great drama and movies. And it's about each side fighting for their side. And we're supposed to have a system that has so many protections in place that if each side is advocating for their side, then the truth will come out. But the reality that we see is something very different. And while prosecutors are supposed to be securing justice, and that's supposed to be their goal, the reality of what we often see is that they are in pursuit of convictions, obtaining them and maintaining them and standing by them at any cost. And that is not something I would ever want to be a part of, but that's the system that we have now.
So throughout your work with the New England Innocence Project, Has anyone from the prosecutorial side kind of taken a step back and said, you know what, I want to come help you? I've seen on this side, and the incorrect approach at justice. I want to come help you. Have you experienced that at all?
So, yes and no. I mean, we've certainly had folks who have volunteered with us who were formerly at prosecutors' offices and who learned things in that context about the culture of prosecution and sort of and which led them, yes, to come to us to say, we'd like to investigate cases because we understand how these things happen, and we'd like to help you with that. And so we certainly see that.
It sounds like they would be great additions to your team because they've got the inside scoop.
Yeah, I mean, I think many different perspectives make this work happen, and unfortunately, we don't have open spots on our team. It is right now, but certainly, I think we look at people who are absolutely committed to people having their freedom, being reunited with their families, thriving in freedom after they're released. This is all a part of the people who make up the New England Innocence Project. And so we value, the perspectives and experiences that people have.
So, Stephanie, throughout your work in the courtroom and with in academia, those on the prosecutorial side, is it always adversarial? I mean, the TV, the movie thing, it's always butting heads. Is it always like that, or is real life different?
What I'll say is that what we tend to see in individual prosecution offices can depend on the person, the leadership and the culture that they are really setting up in their office. And so we have seen in the past examples of certain prosecutors in certain counties who have given us open access to their files, for example, that have led to many exonerations.
So a good work across the table. Good,
And an acknowledgement, yes, this evidence wasn't turned over. It should have been. And of course, you should have access to it. If there's something in our files that shows someone is innocent, of course, we want you to have it. If there's DNA that can be tested that's going to show someone, test it. That would, prosecutors who have that attitude, it can help facilitate justice being done. And we do see it sometimes, but not as often as we'd like.
So in cases where you've had somebody exonerated, have you seen the correct person go to jail or get prosecuted or not?
I don't think we've had a single case where once someone is exonerated, another person is prosecuted for the same crime. What we
Really?
see is that prosecutors actually, even when we have evidence of innocence, even when we have evidence that the conviction lacked integrity, we have prosecutors who stand by the wrongful conviction and maintain that actually nothing went wrong. And so it would not make sense then for them to go and prosecute somebody else for that. And so that's
But
typically what we see.
throughout your process, though, you've presented enough evidence that not only is this person wrong, but it might point to another person being in the wrong.
Well, right. And so courts see what we're saying and they overturn these convictions and people are exonerated. But it's not always the case that the prosecutors or the original police officers are also see it that way. And so that is the thing, is that you can have tunnel vision about something. You can maintain a narrative that you believed in, but turns out to be false. It might be hard for you to then accept that actually it might be hard, especially as a prosecutor, to accept the fact that somebody was in prison for 41 years
Right.
for something they didn't commit. And so sometimes there's denial about that.
So we have about a minute left, and I know this is a 9-minute answer.
Oh
But
my God.
does it all come down to just being short-staffed on every side? Like, are the prosecutors short-staffed that they just don't have the people to do the proper investigations? You guys are short-staffed to do the same, to do the proper investigations. Does it all come down to staffing?
I wouldn't say that, Patrick, because
Really?
the amount of resources that go into policing and prosecution eclipses the amount of resources that go into defense, investigation, and certainly into
Wow.
wrongful conviction work. And so, no, there's a major resource actually divide there. But no, I think it has to do with culture. I think it has to do with sort of relying on tools that are really unreliable. And I think in general, sort of thinking about our criminal legal system as being able to give us safety.
I cannot thank you both enough for giving me an hour of your lives here in this studio, but also driving out here from Boston. What a fascinating conversation. I love the work that you do.
Thank you.
People wrongly convicted. I feel for them so much. So congratulations on the Eddie Wright change. What's the phrase? What would you use?
Exoneration.
Yep.
On that and any of the other exonerations you guys are able to accomplish. Thank you both so
Thank
very
you
much.
so
Thank you,
much,
Patrick.
Patrick.
This is 22 News in Focus with Patrick Berry.